Hey everyone, so today and this week we're going to be talking about policy formation. Policy formation might be the most straightforward square on the policy wheel, especially, I suppose, for people who majored in political science. And I know not everyone in the MPA program did, so I will try to take a step back and not presume you know everything. But this is the traditional way they tell you stuff happened. This is the I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill, and here's how I turn it into a law, right? It's how does policy change on the ground? You have to formulate it, and there are several methods you might go about doing it. So I want to talk about those methods right now because I think selecting the right ones uh, and selecting them up front is key to knowing your strategy for succeeding in writing your policy paper and coming up with your policy change strategy. So number one, you need to know what kind of strategy you want. You need to know which branch of government, and you need to know which level of government. And by that I mean, do you want to implement it at the local, state, or federal level, or all three, or two of the three? And do you want to implement your strategy through the courts, through the executive branch, or through the legislative branch? Knowing that oftentimes you end up having to interact with all three at the end, anyways. But to get the ball rolling, usually you want to start in one spot or another, although sometimes you want a forked approach and you want to go after a couple. All that said, let's go and let's talk about this. Um, Once you know what you want to do, you know what you want to change, you have a strategy for raising awareness and getting your issue on the agenda, you have a strategy for framing your issue and making sure it doesn't get maligned and destroyed before you have a chance to actually formulate it and get it before the legislative committees or regulatory hearings or courtrooms. You need to get it before. Um, you need to start drafting it, right? You need to know exactly like how would I change existing law um, in order to create that change that change that I want. Um, I suppose you can create some sort of policy change simply through cultural change. But typically, if you don't change institutions too, if you don't actually have a legal change to formalize stuff, you don't actually get a policy change, right? You get a lot of people kind of wanting a policy change. Maybe you can get people that de facto act as though policy changes. A great example might be like when you're on 95, right, and you cross over into Mass and from Pawtucket, and all of a sudden you're in Attleboro, and everyone's going about 75, 80 in that left lane, despite the fact that speed limit's 65. Guess the people in Mass kind of de facto chose their speed limit is higher than the state did. But you're still at risk of a statey coming and pulling you over. And it's not the same as actually changing the policy and getting the speed limit raised there, as they've done in New Hampshire and Maine, where you will see 75 mile per hour speed limit signs, right? So, uh, making change, ultimately, the ultimate goal we really want is some sort of a legal change. Now, um, the most straightforward way to do that often is to just say, hey, look, can I do it through statute? But statute can be hard to change. So I think really the way you want to think about it, and I'm just going to put this out there straightforward, is you want to think, what is the easiest way I can make my change happen? And the easiest way to make change, really, often is judicial, then executive, then legislative, and it's at the local, then the state, then the federal level. Making federal legislative change is really, 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 really hard. It's part due to the way the Senate's constructed. It's part due to Senate rules and the filibuster. It's part due to the way there's so many vetoes in the system. But it's really, 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 really hard to get federal legislative change done. And so, if that's your goal, cool. But just realize it could be several years. It's going to be a consistent, persistent battle, and you may never get there. Doesn't mean it's not worth fighting. It just means it's hard, and you're going to need a lot of resources and a lot of time and a lot of mobilized power and a lot of money to make it work. Now, in general, maybe if you have an issue small enough and it's just a small part of it, you can sneak a little piece in. But for big sweeping change, it's very hard to get through that way. A little bit easier is getting something done through executive regulation or executive order. Now, the courts are starting to change that, and they're knocking down more and more of that. So the extent to which this remains true, especially after this Supreme Court session, is questionable. There's also the question of, well, if the president doesn't have to care about, legal consequence, how much can they actually do here? I think that's an open question, too. We're just going to have to see how the future pans out. But for right now, based on the way things have worked heretofore, you can have a regulatory hearing. You can push for the executive branch bodies with regulatory power to promulgate new regulations. You can push for an executive order. And I'll give you a great example of that. The student loan advocates really pushed the Biden administration hard to push forward that student loan forgiveness earlier and last year. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, the court went ahead and knocked it down. The court also knocked down the proposed new payment plan that was supposed to kind of lower the interest rates and the payments for people. Or at least they froze it for the time being. So, the best laid plans of these strategies can go awry because of the courts. And finally, you can have a court strategy. You can actually actively look for lawsuits, like try to find somebody injured by a policy you want to change, injured by the status quo measure of the policy, and sue. Or injured by a new change that you don't like, that went the direction you don't like, and sue for an injunction. Bring cases, try to bring them up higher in the court, try to bring them to appeals, try to get the courts to change things. So those are kind of your three strategies. Now you can do it at the local level, and it's going to be easier to get into a municipal court or to get into a city council or to get in the mayor's ear and get a change that way than it is at the state level, where at least in Rhode Island you have pretty good access. So it's not like Albany or Sacramento where you kind of need to be pretty high up to get in these people's ears. You can do it here. It's one of the nice things about government in Rhode Island. But you can get into the General Assembly's ear. You can get into the Senate's ear. You can get into the governor's ear. You can push to get into the state courts. Much harder to do at the federal level. It can be done, but it's more difficult. Excuse me. So, that's kind of the strategy you want to do. Now, you want to be able to draft this bill, which means you probably want a lawyer or a team of lawyers. Ultimately, they have legislative counsel. If you're going to send it in the legislation, legislatures usually have committees. They're going to mark it up. They're going to change whatever you give them. But if you have some text to start with that you say, this accomplishes what I want done, and if that text is pretty neat, pretty legal beagle, fits in with existing statute well, is numbered properly, very easy for them to understand, very easy for their counsel to understand exactly what you want, you're much more likely to get what you want on the other side of the sausage-making process. So being sure you can draft legislation, now that's a skill. And maybe you don't have it in-house. Maybe you have to hire someone to develop it for you. There are lawyers out there that help do that. There are lobbyists out there that help do that. There are lobbyists who are lawyers out there who help do that. So those can be a strategy too. But formulating your policy, knowing where you want to inject your policy, knowing the order you want to try to accomplish it. Sometimes it helps if you're pushing something in the legislature and it's stuck in committee to have a protest or two. Being able to mobilize the mass public at the same time and have an inside-out strategy. Outside strategy can help. Sometimes that can anger the people you work with in the legislature and backfire. So you have to really think through your strategy. What's my strategy for getting my text together, for formulating my policy, and how do I get the decision makers to make the decisions I need to turn this policy from a dream into a reality on the books. Once that happens, though, the policy still needs to be implemented on the ground, and that is our topic for next week.